There is a moment, quiet, unexpected, ordinary, when something inside you stops. Not your breath, not your heartbeat, something deeper, something older. You are walking down a street you have never visited before, or perhaps you are watching the rain trace lines down a window, or you are sitting in a museum looking at a painting from a civilization that crumbled centuries before you were born. And without warning, without logic, without any rational explanation your mind can offer, your chest fills with a sensation that does not belong to this life. A knowing, a pull, a grief that feels like homecoming. You have been here before. Not in this body, not with this name, but you have been here. And something in the architecture of your soul has never forgotten. Perhaps you have dismissed this feeling. Perhaps you have named it fantasy, or overactive imagination, or the mind's strange habit of pattern recognition. The world we live in is not always generous with mystery. It prefers explanations it can measure, weigh, and file away. But there are things that resist filing. There are experiences that live in a layer beneath language, beneath logic, beneath the careful structures of modern thought. And what you have felt, in those suspended moments of unexpected recognition, belongs to that layer entirely. In many esoteric and spiritual traditions across the world, the soul is understood not as a single flame that burns once and then extinguishes, but as a traveler. Ancient, curious, moving through lives the way a river moves through landscapes, shaped by each one, carrying traces of all of them. The Vedic traditions of India speak of this journey in their oldest texts. Indigenous wisdom keepers of the Americas speak of souls who walk many roads before they return to the source. Celtic spiritual lore describes the soul as a wanderer between worlds, gathering wisdom the way a bee gathers pollen, from flower to flower, from life to life. And in certain Pleiadian, centered spiritual teachings, the soul is understood as something even grander than this, a cosmic seed, planted not just across time, but across dimensions, across star systems, across forms of existence that the human mind, in its current state, can only reach the edges of in dreams. According to some who have dedicated their lives to these teachings, certain souls carry within them what might be called a multi-dimensional archive. Not a memory in the way we typically understand memory. Not a file to be opened, a moment to be replayed, but a frequency, an imprint, a resonance that hums underneath the ordinary surface of a human life, occasionally rising, occasionally pressing through, occasionally arriving in the body as something that has no name in the language of the everyday world. And you may have felt this. You may be feeling it now. Think about the places that have called to you without reason. Not the places on travel lists, not the destinations recommended by others, but the landscapes that appeared in your mind unbidden, perhaps in childhood, perhaps in a dream, and left behind them a longing you could not explain. Some people feel this toward ancient Egypt, some toward the forests of the Celtic lands, some toward Japan or Peru or the wide silence of the Mongolian steppe, some toward coastlines they have never visited, but that appear in their dreams with the familiarity of a room they grew up in. According to certain spiritual perspectives, these pulls are not random. They are not simply the product of a book read in childhood or an image seen somewhere and forgotten. They are the soul's navigational system, attempting, across the noise of a modern life, to transmit coordinates. Locations where the archive holds something important, where a past thread brushes close enough to the surface of the present that the soul cannot help but lean toward it. And then there are the people, the strangers who do not feel like strangers. You have met them, perhaps only once, in passing. Perhaps they have become central to your life, but there was a moment of recognition that preceded any logical basis for recognition. You looked at someone, or heard their voice, or simply stood near them, and something in you said, "I know you." Not the polite social knowing of acquaintance, not the knowing of shared history in this life. Something older, something that carried beneath it the emotional weight of long familiarity, of things lived through together, of a history that predates the current chapter entirely. Many spiritual traditions would say that souls tend to travel in groups, that the relationships of one life carry forward, in altered forms, in other lives. The teacher becomes the student. The parent becomes the child. The stranger who helped you once becomes the friend who anchors you now. According to Pleiadian-centered spiritual narratives, some of these soul connections span not just lifetimes on this earth, but other realms of existence entirely. Other stars. Other agreements made in the luminous space before the veil of forgetting descended. But here is where it becomes interesting. Where it becomes more than a beautiful idea and begins to touch something you may recognize in your own experience. The soul does not only carry its history in the form of longing. It carries it in the form of gifts that arrived without obvious origin. Skills that appeared with unusual ease. Languages that felt like recognition rather than learning. Arts that came naturally in ways you could not fully account for. Some children sit at a piano for the first time, and something in their hands already knows the keys. Some people pick up a brush and paint with a confidence that has no connection to practice. Some feel the ancient rhythms of certain kinds of music in their bodies before they have ever consciously heard them, as though the music is not reaching them from the outside, but waking something that was always already there, waiting. In some esoteric interpretations, these gifts are understood as skills brought forward from other lives, competencies developed across long arcs of existence, carried not in the brain, which is new with each incarnation, but in what some traditions call the higher self, the aspect of the soul that persists across all its expressions. And then, of course, there are the dreams. This is perhaps where the archive presses closest to the surface, in the state between waking and sleep, in the deep passages of the night when the conscious mind loosens its grip on what it has decided is real. Something else tends to rise. Some people dream consistently of other eras, of clothing that is not contemporary, of buildings that carry the architectural logic of another century, another continent, another world. Some dream of relationships with an emotional texture that exceeds anything in their current life, of losses that leave them grieving in the morning for people they cannot name, places they cannot find on any map. Some dream in settings that feel both unfamiliar and deeply, achingly known. And they wake carrying the residue of lives they have not lived in this body, but perhaps have lived somewhere, someone in the vast and patient architecture of the soul's long journey. What might this mean if one were to sit with it not as a conclusion, but as a question? What would it mean to let the strange pang of recognition in an ancient museum, or the pull toward an unknown landscape, or the grief that arrives on a Tuesday morning with no apparent cause, be treated not as noise to be filtered out, but as signal? Not as malfunction, but as transmission, according to the framework of certain spiritual traditions, and particularly within the Pleiadian influenced teachings that have moved through esoteric communities for decades. The soul that is approaching a threshold of greater awareness begins to receive these signals with increasing frequency and intensity. The archive, which has always been there, begins to press more insistently toward consciousness, not because it wants to disrupt the current life, not because it is pulling the soul backward, but because there are things in the past, patterns, unresolved frequencies, gifts not yet fully reclaimed, that the soul requires in order to move forward fully, in order to embody, in this present life, the full resonance of what it has gathered across its long journey. You may have noticed this process accelerating in your own experience, moments of déjà vu arriving more frequently and carrying more weight than they once did, dreams becoming more vivid, more emotionally dense, leaving behind them a residue that does not dissolve by noon, an increasing sensitivity to certain periods of history, certain pieces of music, certain kinds of light, a growing sense that the life you are living is part of something larger, not just in the vague inspirational sense, but in a structural sense, a sense that you are one chapter in a much longer story, and that the earlier chapters are beginning to make themselves felt in the one you are currently writing. What might you do with this, if you chose to take it seriously, not as literal truth that demands proof, but as a living metaphor that invites exploration? Many people find that simply paying attention to these signals, rather than dismissing them, changes something in how the present life feels. The unexplained pull toward a place becomes an invitation. The inexplicable skill becomes a source of curiosity and reverence rather than a thing to be explained away. The stranger who feels like an old friend becomes someone to be greeted with a different quality of openness. And the grief that arrives without context, the grief for lives lived elsewhere, for things once had and then released, begins to be held with a gentleness it has perhaps never before been given. Because here is something that many spiritual teachers, across many traditions, have suggested about the weight that humans carry, that does not seem to come from this life alone. Some of the heaviness is not about this story. Some of the fear is not about this chapter. Some of the longing for something that cannot be named, the longing for a home that cannot be located on any map of this world, is not a wound of this existence. It is the ache of a soul that has traveled far, that has worn many forms, that has loved and lost and built and released across an expanse of experience that the current human mind cannot fully contain. And when that ache is recognized for what it might be, rather than treated as a symptom to be managed or a confusion to be corrected, something in the body often softens. Something held very tight, without the holder knowing how long they have been holding it, begins to release. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from having answers, but from recognizing the right questions, from allowing the mystery to be held rather than solved, from saying, with genuine openness, perhaps I am more than this one story, perhaps the gifts I carry came from somewhere my current mind cannot fully reach. Perhaps the connections I feel, across time and logic, and the ordinary limits of a single life, are real in ways that matter even if they cannot be measured. Perhaps the soul is a traveler, and I am here, in this body, in this era, carrying everything it has gathered, and everything it has gathered has brought me here, to this moment, to this breath, to whatever it is that I am about to understand, that I could not have understood before. The Pleiades have been a point of reverence in human culture across millennia. The ancient Greeks named them. The Aboriginal Australians mapped their stories around them. The Aztec calendar was built in relation to their cycle. The Japanese called them Subaru, and saw in their clustering something to navigate by. Across indigenous, ancient, and esoteric traditions, this small cluster of stars has been understood as a source of something that cannot quite be named in practical language. Guidance, wisdom, a reminder that the universe is not empty and the soul is not alone, and the story of consciousness on this earth is far longer and stranger and more beautiful than the short chapter currently visible from inside a single human life. In some Pleiadian-centered spiritual teachings, the transmission that reaches sensitive souls through the symbols and feelings and unexplained recognitions described in this message is understood as a kind of gentle recalibration. The soul, which came into this life carrying the archive of its long journey, is being invited to reconnect with what it knows. Not to leave the present, not to disappear into the past, but to bring the depth and the gifts and the hard-won wisdom of many lives into full and present engagement with the life that is actually happening now, to let the ancient inform the current, to let what has been carried for so long finally be of use. This is not a message that asks you to believe anything. It does not ask for certainty, or faith, or the adoption of any particular framework. It only asks whether you have felt these things, whether the moments of inexplicable recognition have visited you, whether you have stood in a place and felt you were standing in a memory, whether you have met someone and felt you were resuming a conversation, whether the grief without context, the longing without a specific object, the love that seems too large for this single life to have generated it, have been your companions. And if they have, it asks only that you consider the possibility of holding them with a little more reverence than you have perhaps allowed yourself to do. Not as noise, not as confusion, but as signal, as the voice of a soul that has traveled very far and is trying, through whatever language it can find, to remind you of who you are. You have lived before, perhaps many times, in many forms, in many places, and everything you have lived has brought you here. Everything you have gathered across that long journey lives in you now, waiting not to be remembered in the way a specific event is remembered, but to be felt, to be honored, to be brought forward. The archive is not locked. It is simply waiting for you to grow quiet enough to hear it. And perhaps, in this moment, you already are.